Welcome to the CST Flight Services video series. I'm Rick Gardner, and in this video, we're going to discuss things that you should take into consideration when planning a trip to Central America. In addition to this video, we recommend that you also watch our video on documents and equipment for international flights, as well as U.S. procedures. And if you plan to fly over Mexico or land in Mexico along the way, you should also watch our video on Mexico procedures as well. We have a link here that will help you access those videos. So let's take a look at what kind of weather we could expect on a trip to Central America. The very geography of Central America provokes a wide variety of weather patterns. The dry season is usually from January to March. If you plan to fly to Managua or Costa Esmeralda in Nicaragua or to Liberia, Costa Rica during this period, expect very strong winds, which are fortunately aligned down the runways. Within some countries, you can find microclimates, where weather conditions can be radically different in one area versus that of another area a short distance away. When planning a trip, check the historical weather patterns for the areas that you plan to visit. While not as common as countries further north, hurricanes have been known to hit Central American countries. So during the hurricane season, don't forget to keep an eye on the National Hurricane Center website. The CST member website contains a wide variety of sources for international weather. While CST does not produce the international weather information, it has identified a number of resources over the years that do, and we've organized links to those resources in a manner that should be familiar to pilots. There are several different options for charts for a flight to Central America. Let's take a look. The FAA publishes IFR en route charts that covers Central America, although lately they have begun to reduce the amount of information in detail that they contain. At one time, the U.S. Department of Defense used to publish Operational Navigation Charts, or ONC charts. While those charts have long been gone for about 40 years, they can still provide very useful topographical information that, when combined with IFR charts, can be very, very useful. IFR charts and ONC charts can be downloaded for free from the CST Flight Services member website. Let's now cover some additional topics that could also be useful for planning your trip. As with most other countries, Mexico charges airspace fees and overtime fees for air traffic control. However, unlike other countries, Mexico has an extremely complicated process for calculating and for paying airspace and overtime fees. If you have any doubts, contact CST Flight Services and we can help orient you on how to determine if you owe and how to pay whatever fees may be owed. CST Flight Services member gets special pricing when paying Mexican airspace fees. When planning a trip to Central America, it is very important to take into consideration the terrain. For those departing the U.S. from the West Coast, try to follow the coastline as far as possible before turning inland. If you are coming from the central U.S., consider departing from South Texas and crossing from the Gulf of Mexico coast to the Pacific coast through the Ixtepec Pass and continuing on. If you plan to depart from South Florida, you can also fly down the east coast of the Yucatan Peninsula and then cross over to the Pacific coast through central Honduras. You can also fly down the Caribbean coastline of Honduras and Nicaragua, but the challenge along this route is the lack of international airports and avgas. After you pass La Ceiba, you have to go to Limon, Costa Rica, and then from there all the way to Panama. For those with aircraft that have the performance and overwater capability, you can also overfly Cuba to the Cayman Islands and then continue on to Panama. If you are planning to enter Mexico from anywhere other than the US or Canada, then you need to make your first landing in Mexico at either Tapachula on the Pacific coast or Cozumel on the Caribbean coast. Therefore, if you're planning to enter Mexico from the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Central America, or South America, you should determine between Tapachula and Cozumel which one of those two airports best suits your route of flight, considering your final destination in Mexico. You need to take into consideration what airspaces you will be flying through on your way to and within Central America. Depending upon your route of flight, you may cross into a variety of different airspaces. This table is a brief summary of those countries and flight information regions that require overflight permits and/or charge for the use of their airspace. It is important to point out that COSESNA is not a country, but rather a corporation created by all the Central American countries, with the exception of Panama, to manage their FEAR. These countries all underlie the COSESNA airspace. You can see that most Central American countries require prior permit approval to land in or to overfly their country. Fortunately, as a CST Flight Services member, the forms and the procedures to accomplish this yourself can be found on the CST member website. If your route takes you over territorial Cuba, you will need to get a Cuban overflight permit and pay their airspace fees. While Cuba normally requires an overflight permit to fly inside their airspace, there are some routes where this may not be necessary. Historically, Green 765 and Upper Green 765 did not require a Cuban overflight permit. However, that has changed, and those airways now do require a Cuban overflight permit. You can obtain Cuban overflight permits at any time by going to the CST Flight Services main website. If you plan to fly around Cuba under VFR while inside their airspace, you must remain outside their Inner Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. Central American countries require that your first landing and your last takeoff be made from an airport of entry, or AOE. It is extremely important to bear in mind that if you wish to enter Mexico from a country other than the US or Canada, you must make your first landing in Mexico in either Tapachula or Cozumel. Another important consideration when planning your route is fuel availability. Always plan enough fuel to fly to your planned destination and still have enough fuel to fly to another destination where fuel is available. Fuel in Central America is typically measured in gallons. However, any fuel additives like Prist that you may require can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find. So we recommend that you bring it with you. Central American airports of entry and fuel prices are available on the CST Flight Services member website. Here are some other topics that you should also consider when planning a trip to Central America. Just because a fuel truck is working today does not mean it's going to be working tomorrow. Bring whatever fuel additives you may need with you. Always plan on having enough fuel to take you to an alternate, just in case. Always select an alternate that has the characteristics necessary for your flight, such as fuel or airport of entry. Now let's take a look at what the procedures for flying into, within, and out of Central America looks like. With regards to experimental aircraft and basic med, I'm afraid the information's not so good. Per FAA requirements, we must obtain in writing permission from the countries whose airspace we plan to fly within before making that flight, and that permission in writing must be carried aboard our aircraft. Unfortunately, basic med is not accepted as a medical certificate in Central America. Different Central American countries have their own unique restrictions and requirements. For those planning to fly to San Pedro in Belize, be advised that parking is usually extremely limited and restricted, so check in advance and have a backup plan. Air traffic in some countries may give altimeter settings in hectopascals, so be prepared to convert to inches of mercury or ask ATC to give you the altimeter setting in inches of mercury. There may be other things that could also be measured using the metric system. If you obtain a permit to fly within Costa Rica, you need to become aware of the local procedures for filing and closing VFR flight plans and the frequencies and telephone numbers required to do so. Health restrictions can also apply. Honduras has an online pre-check system that you might want to take advantage of that can help expedite your entry into the country. Ground handling is now mandatory at the San Jose Airport in Costa Rica, the Juan Santa Maria, Mike Romeo Oscar Charlie, as well as the Liberia Airport, Mike Romeo Lima Bravo. If you are planning to remain in a Central American country with your aircraft for an extended period of time, you should consult with the civil aviation authorities, customs authorities, and immigration authorities of that country to determine in advance how long both you and your aircraft can remain in that country. Disinspection is still a common practice in some Central American countries, so don't be surprised if you get a visit from the bug man. You must always enter a Central American country through an International Airport of Entry, or AOE. Remember, these are listed in the CST member website. You must always be on either a VFR or IFR flight plan when entering a Central American country coming from another country. If you departed a country other than the US or Canada and arrived in a Central American country, you should have with you a stamped copy of the Outward General Declaration form from the country you departed. This document is frequently requested by the authorities of the arrival country to prove where you departed from. When you arrive in a Central American country, you will also be expected to provide copies of an inward General Declaration form. The format of the form and how many copies can vary from country to country. You will also be required to complete an immigration form for each person in the group, and typically you will receive a receipt or stub which you do not want to lose, as you will have to surrender it on departure. Some countries may want you to complete a customs declaration form, and it's usually one per family. If you plan to fly within a Central American country after having cleared into the country, bear in mind that each country has its own unique authorization process to do so. Be sure you check in advance before attempting to fly within a country. Most Central American countries require that all flights within their country, regardless of VFR or IFR, be on an active flight plan. You can find country-specific information and procedures in the CST Flight Services member website. You must always depart a Central American country through an AOE. You will need to present an Outward General Declaration form. Make sure that at least one copy is returned to you with the stamps from the local authorities. You will need to surrender the stub or copies of the immigration forms you completed on arrival, and you usually have to pay some form of a departure tax and airport and/or FBO fees as appropriate. Lastly, you'll need to file an ICAO flight plan form with local ATC for your flight to the next country you plan to visit. And once again, when entering Mexico from a country other than the US or Canada, you must make your first landing in either Tapachula on the Pacific coast or Cozumel on the Caribbean coast. You can find useful country-specific information such as airports of entry, fuel prices, general declaration forms, the procedures and forms for requesting overflight and landing permits in Central America, and much, much more in the CST Flight Services member website. Here are some other useful tips that you might want to keep in mind when flying within Central America. When communicating with air traffic control, use your full tail number. Don't use slang like Skylane 123 Alpha, Bonanza 123 Alpha. Use your full tail number. November 123 Alpha. Always have your overflight and landing permits for Central American countries handy as you may be requested to provide those numbers while in flight. If you are unsure of what ATC has instructed you to do, always clarify. Never assume. There is no night VFR in Central America, and as Central America is typically a non-radar environment, you can expect requests for a position report in radial and DME. And for IFR, well, DME arcs are alive and well in Central America and commonly used for a number of different instrument procedures. Things can change rapidly in international aviation, and Central America is no exception. So always check notices to air mission and check them again. Some airports can also impose landing and parking restrictions at certain times of the year. If you're apprehensive about flying VFR between these countries, you might want to consider flying under IFR. Communications can sometimes be a challenge in certain parts of these countries, so either try to fly higher or use other aircraft in the vicinity to help relay information for you. Always, always, always clarify. Never assume. When landing at non-towered airports, always check the runway surface before committing yourself to land. Be on your game. Don't be complacent. Things can get really exciting otherwise. On IFR flights, beware RNP, Required Navigation Performance, approaches. Treat those as an RNP AR approach in the US, where you must have a specific letter of authorization to fly that approach. At certain times of the year, the temperatures can be extremely high in certain airports in Central America, which can pose a problem to oil viscosity in certain aircraft. For more information and resources for planning and executing an international flight, the CST member website contains a wealth of information that we have amassed over the years and keep up to date with our daily operations. This concludes our video on planning a trip to Central America. We hope that this information was useful. Take advantage of the other videos in the video series because they can contain information that could be very, very useful and important for planning your trip.